Hello, everyone. It is very good to be here for all of the reasons that the commissioner just mentioned. It is a real privilege to be in a place where there are so many leaders, all of you in this room and many of your colleagues around the state, doing the work that we're here to discuss. I'm particularly interested in this food charter that you folks have been developing, as well as the work of many other leaders within the state. So my task is to provide an entree into a topic which is really an integration of the interest of many different audiences that are actually sitting in this room today. And food access, I think, is a nice introductory title. We could spend a lot of time just getting into what that topic actually means. And so what I'd like to do is to actually start out by setting up a conversation between two titans of industry. And this may sound like it's a little bit of a non sequitur, but there's a lesson that I'd like to extract from this to apply to food security. So let me set this up for you. So there is an annual conference called All Things Digital that some of those of you in the room who may be techies may be familiar with, held out in Carlsbad, California, every year. And we're going to see an interview of the host of this conference, a fellow by the name of Walt Mossberg, who's a technology columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He's interviewing in 2007 Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. And we're going to be picking up the conversation at a point where it has just been established that Mr. Jobs took the leadership of Apple Corporation after having been away for a number of years at a time when that company was about to go under. It was about maybe 3 to 6 months from going bankrupt. By 2007, that company had been turned around in a particular way that will be studied in business schools for decades, probably. But that is the point at which we're picking this up. And there's an individual who will be the subject of the conversation by name of Joe Amelio. Joe Amelio was the immediate predecessor of Mr. Jobs in the job of trying to turn around this company, unsuccessful, but he did hire Mr. Jobs to return to the company. So this is the point where we're going to be picking up the conversation, and then we'll talk about what the lesson is that I believe is there for us to take for the topic of food security.
Weekend and all this stuff, and next thing I knew, Steve called me up and said, "Don't worry about that negotiation with Gil Amelio. You can just talk to me now." And I said, "Wow."
Gil was a nice guy, but he had a saying. He said, Apple is like a ship with a hole in the bottom, leaking water. And my job is to get the ship pointed in the right direction.
Okay.
So a lesson here that I'll summarize very briefly is, if you don't get the diagnosis correctly, it is impossible to get the prescription correct. And so when it comes to the topic of food access, I would like to begin with a couple of very difficult but honest statements about why we have an issue with food access in the country. We want to end up with the topic of what to do about it. We're here to inspire one another and to take positive action. But we need to have an accurate diagnosis of what the issue is that we're dealing with. So let me jump right into this by giving you a story. I think it's often easier for all of us to understand the principle of an issue when we're not involved and therefore have no reason to be defensive about the moral of a story. And so we're going to start out far, far away on the other side of the world. And I want to tell you a story about Western Africa, and in particular a story that takes place along the drainage watershed of the river Niger. And so just so that for those of us not familiar with it, we see what the course of that river is, the area that it drains, and then the specific delta where it empties out into the Atlantic Ocean. That's a little illustration of it. So what I'd like to do is to read you a story And it's going to require a little bit of a setup. So the story that I'm going to tell you about goes back about 130 years. And it involves the people known as the brass. Now, the brass people had set up treaties, negotiated agreements with English business people, entrepreneurs, who were exploiting, among other things, the palm oil that could be harvested along this entire watershed. And the way that the treaties among the English and the brass worked was that, for all intents and purposes, the brass were the middle people. So they would aggregate the supply of the palm oil nuts from down the watershed and then deliver them at the delta to the English. Now, when they did this, they essentially abandoned a self-provisioning system that depended on them farming plantains and yams on that river delta. And they became accustomed to this particular mode of business, and it worked out well for them for years until the British worked very hard to eliminate those middle people, and using steamboats went up the river in order to be able to aggregate that supply themselves. And so it's at this point that we pick up the story, and you'll see in the words of King Okiya, one of the brass, in a letter dated to Whitehall, February 21, 1877, the following words. And I'm just going to skip through here, but there will be enough continuity for you to pick up the story. It says, "We, the undersigned kings and chiefs of brass, west coast of Africa, beg and pray that you will take our case into consideration. Some years ago, the white men began trading on the Niger with the intention of opening up this river. This did us no harm, as they went up a long way farther than we could go in their steamers, and also bought a different kind of produce to what we were buying. But lately, within the last 6 years, they have begun putting trading stations at our places, and consequently, they have stopped our trade completely, as well as those on the lower part of the river Niger. And formerly, when we sent nearly 5,000 tons of palm oil away, we do not now send 1,500 per annum. This means starvation to my people, and as well as to the natives of the Niger under my rule. I have about 8,000 people, and there are another 8,000 people in the lower part of the Niger suffering with me. It is very hard this on us and all the other rivers in the Bight as well. The markets are secured to them, and why should a difference be made for this, my river?" Now, this particular part is a part that I really want to underscore. The king says, "We have no land where we can grow plantains or yams, and if we cannot trade, we must starve. And we earnestly beg and pray that you will take our case into consideration." Now, the reason why I want to underscore that is that the king has very explicitly made an economic case. Those of you who are economists can tell us all about the factors of production, basically land, labor, rent, entrepreneurship. You need to have access to at least one of those in order to be able to produce, in order to be able to fend for yourself. The king has said each one of these in turn have been eliminated in terms of their access to us. If we don't have access to at least one of them, we will starve. And so, as one sovereign to another, he is writing to the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, stating the case, claiming rights agreed to by treaty. And so, he ends this letter by saying, and I'll repeat that part because I think it is very important, "We have no land where we can grow plantains or yams, and if we cannot trade, we must starve. And we earnestly beg and pray that you will take our case into consideration. We do not want anything that is not fair. We only want the markets that we and our money have made to be secured to us, and that the white men who have had nothing to do with opening up the palm oil trade shall not come and reap all our benefits." So there's a clear story, not only of appropriation of resources and factors of production, it's very clear that the brass know exactly what is happening to them. And I don't know how much you have read or followed how international treaty and trade negotiations are pursued today, but they're pursued pretty much in this way. You lay claim to who the original owners of resources are, who has precedent for the utilization of particular factors of production, how trade agreements are going to be established, and so on. And so this is a very sophisticated plea. So remember the date here. The date this was sent was February 1, 21, 1877, sent to what is the equivalent of the Department of State at the time in Queen Victoria's government. And it was duly recorded, filed, stamped. That's why I can tell you all these details about this letter. And the Queen nor her prime minister ever responded. And the brass died. They starved, which is why you've never heard of the brass. But I pass this along as an example of folks who knew exactly what was happening to them, and it was this actually deprivation of factors of production. They're not asking for charity. They were simply noticing that their resources by which they could fend for themselves were being taken away from them. Now, this is a story that has played over in the history of humanity thousands of times, and is the story that I mentioned that we needed to cover and be honest about when we talked about food access in the United States at present. So just to bring you up to date, this is actually the Niger River Delta at present times. It gives us a little bit of an idea of what it may have been like about 150 years ago. And this is another view. Some of you that follow international news may be familiar with the fact that this is an area where there is still exactly the same sort of tension, except that this time the resource is not palm oil, but fossil fuel, actual petroleum. And that area has been turned into a wasteland, and that the natives of the area continue to be displaced in favor of the fuel for our vehicles. And so the form that this takes today, now we actually have a name for these sorts of things, and we recognize and are quite explicit about what's going on. And we know, all of us that follow the international news, that in essence, this dynamic is a series of land grabs of the wealthy countries from around the world, essentially extending their food footprint and their natural resource footprint outside from the geographic borders of their own country. Well, let's not go so far. Let's take a look at data for the United States that document poverty by race and ethnicity. And these are data, I know that all of you are experts in this area, so we're just recapping things that are very familiar to you. What I'm comparing here is the poverty rate by the demographic breakdown of ethnicity. And so that you see that, as the commissioner mentioned, for people of color, there's a disproportionate poverty rate among the folks of color. What happened? So surely there must be some explanation, and the explanation is in history. And so let's begin with a land grab story. Exactly the same sort of thing. You know, it would have been more difficult for us to get into this without an example to show us what we're talking about from other parts of the world and another time in history, but exactly the same phenomenon. And as a matter of fact, when any of us should happen to hear the pious sentiment in modern times about how blessed we are to be in this productive land, and particularly in this productive breadbasket, we need to remember that there were some very deliberate actions taken in order to assure that we, quote, have this productive land. Now, I'm being honest with you about this, and immediately quoting one of the wisest people I've ever been around, the former governor of Coche de Pueblo, New Mexico, who said, we need to know these things and remember them. We can't be fooled about those sorts of things. But we are the people now that are determining what the future is going to be like. So we need to be clear about what we want, what we're going to do differently from what people did before us. It's in our hands. So that's what we're here to do, but not being deluded about why we're here to begin with, why we have this issue of food access. So in essence, going back to that original chart of the breakdown demographically, if you go and look for the poorest people in this nation, these were the people that were deprived of their land and a mode of subsistence. If you follow up and take a look at some of the other people of color that also suffer a disproportionate poverty rate, you find that in essence, they were violently ripped away from their home, transported across the ocean, more than 10 million of them, brutalized and exploited, worse than animals, for a century and a half, and then intentionally deprived of the right to benefit from the wealth that their labor helped to create, to the present date. Because if you recognize what headlines say, there is unfinished business in this country. When you read about turning back voter rights, for instance, this is exactly what we're talking about. And we live at a time when if you go into the back of restaurants, and if you look at the way that houses are built, and if you look at the way in which our crops are picked, you see that there's an entire underclass of folks who are exploited for their labor, without whom that exploitation, our entire economy would not work, period. It would fall apart. So these are very hard things that all of us in this room want to reverse, because food access is just a teeny symptom of what is actually underlying that reality. But let's go forward again with Regis's words of wisdom. We have to know that. We have to be informed about that. We have to be wise about that. And now we need to decide what to do in order to change the reality ahead of us. So let's talk about the way that this system works for those of us for whom it does work well. So you know that for half of us, getting our meals involves the luxury of basically just thinking about what you might be in the mood for. So I checked on Google just before coming up here, and within a mile radius here, I have a choice of about 12 sit-down restaurants where if I wanted to have Thai, if I wanted to have Cantonese, if I wanted to have a pizza, all I have to do is desire it. And within 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, I'm sitting down, everything is taken care of for me. The piping hot food is brought to me. I don't have to worry about how it's prepared, where it came from, who's going to clean up the dishes. I just want it. And because I can pay for it, I can have whatever I want. And for the other half of our food, we'll deign to take about 20 minutes of our time to assemble stuff from ingredients that we've gone and procured about once a week in order to be able to do that. And so roughly about a 50-50 split in terms of how we actually procure our meals. In order for this to work, we first of all have to be powerful. It may be redundant to point that out. But what this means, you realize, is that if you decide that you want to have Italian, Chinese, Mexican, whatever it is that you want here in Duluth, Minnesota, whether it's in season or not, whether it's actually native to this region or not, you can have it if you can pay for it. Which means that there is a complex system of logistics that must exist behind a veil someplace that actually makes this system possible. And so there are, in fact, vast supply chains that actually make it possible, whether you're going to want it or not, that these restaurants that I've mentioned are capable of sating your desire without knowing whether you'll come in the front door or not. Their cost of doing business is they have to be ready for that eventuality. So they have to have all of that in place. So there's a vast global logistics chain that each one of us commands. The resources of the world flow to us. We're that powerful. We are that rich. Whether we're actually going to utilize them today or not, that system is in place for us. That's how it works for those of us for whom it works. It's a thing of beauty. So the story, then, is a story of power. And this is a recurrent theme in all of the stories that we've seen so far. So behind that veil, there's actually a very complex system. And actually, in this part of the world, this doesn't need to be explained to anyone because this is a part of the world where we simultaneously benefit from that system, and we are the system. We live in that system. And so those resources, which I'll just, again, being very sober about this, we have appropriated. Those resources are utilized in this particular way that you see, sold to us in this particular way as well. Behind it, there is this massive system which adds expense, which is why we must be very rich and powerful. Because as we'll remark more than once before I'm done here, this is really a story about how we're saving ourselves time. We're doing it through the food system, but what we're buying is convenience. So there's this apparatus, this tremendous apparatus, which is saving us all the time, which results in all kinds of distortions that we'll be mentioning along the way. Here, the one distortion that I'll mention is that in most cases, the packaging in which the food is delivered to you is way more expensive than the actual food in which that food has been conveyed from wherever in the world it has come to you. Now, the result is this apparent bounty, and I say because not all of us are able to access that is the point, where if you walk into any typical grocery store, you know there's over about 50,000 manufactured processed products in there. out of about a total of 600,000 that exist at any given time, but about 50,000 of them are in constant churn. Very few of them are actual perennial winners in a setting like this. So you can walk in here and basically be subjective to intensive marketing in terms of what it is that you're going to select from to state your desires. And I want to talk to you about these retail centers, which is the way in which we access this wealth of resources about half of the time, as I mentioned, because one of the things that we actually need to understand is this notion in food access that we actually are the beneficiaries of the cheapest, most abundant, the safest food supply in the world. It's a cant. It's almost like a doxology that you hear about this system. So I wanted to talk to you about the basic premise about it being the cheapest. And it may seem like I'm actually talking out of both sides of my mouth, because the data are these. You're all quite familiar. Over the course of the prior century up until the present, this is what has happened to the amount of money that each household spends in order to be able to meet their food needs. And so you see that in the United States, this figure has now descended below 10%. And this is actually what we look at when we make that claim. So let me leave that with you to muse about, and we're going to come back to this after we learn a few more things in order to be able to deconstruct this and understand why that is actually not illustrating that our food is cheap. So what I'd like to do is talk to you about the way in which this system came about. Again, under the premise that in order to have an accurate prescription, we need to have an accurate diagnosis. And I'll give you the punchline, in case I lose you along the way here. The punchline at the beginning is, we made this system, we can make it different. So it's not a given, it's not a feature of the universe. This is a human creation. And according to what this society needs, as the commissioner has said, collectively, we can define a different system. Now, there's obstacles along the way, and we'll be as realistic as I have been about the historical realities in terms of identifying those obstacles and what needs to be done. There's any number of places where you could begin this story. I'm an agricultural scientist, and so this is one of my favorite places to begin, which is with the establishment of the state land-grant colleges of agriculture and mechanical arts, today's ag schools. As the majority of you will know, they were established by Abraham Lincoln. The mechanism was essentially granting of land in which states could choose to sell or to utilize in order to establish their agricultural schools. And the premise was that these were to be schools of the people. And at the time, the 1860s, the majority of the people were rural. Their issues were issues of how to be self-provisioning successfully out in the rural environment. And so these schools were dedicated to that. And Mr. Lincoln was busy around this period of time. It would be a fascinating thing to get into. This is not the place to understand why he himself desired to establish this system, but suffice it to say that he spent hours upon hours as a child and a teenager at the sharp end of a team of horses and a plow. And you can just imagine how often he thought that there had to be a better way. And this was a time when the system that we just described not only did not exist, no one could possibly have imagined it. The majority of our waking hours for both men and women involved answering the question, how are we going to feed ourselves, all the way from producing the stuff to preserving it, preparing it, processing it. And there was gender specialization that to this day affects how we think of who we are and what our worth is. We're essentially emerging from that gender specialization that had to do with the way in which we answer that question. But one of the things that Lincoln did about this, because he was in a position to do something about this eventually, was that in 1862, he established the United States Department of Agriculture. Prior to that, there had been collectors of seed. They'd actually been in the patent office, and you practiced something that was more akin to husbandry than to what today we would call science. So Lincoln intentionally meant for hard sciences to be applied to agriculture. The establishment of the land-grant schools that I just mentioned occurred in 1862 as well. And the following year, he established the National Academy of Sciences explicitly to advise Congress on a scientific basis for important decisions that they needed to make. Now, you notice those dates. You know that Mr. Lincoln was preoccupied with a few other things on his mind, but this was such a priority for him, and it has turned out to have a huge impact in terms of the development of the food system of this nation. And, in fact, it set a whole chain of events in motion. So it was around this period of time as well that time was eliminated in terms of the intercontinental railroad, making it simpler to get from one part of the country to the other. New modes of traction made it possible to cover more area of land. Refrigeration in those railroad cars made it possible that you could get perishables across vastly greater distances. New modes of traction as well as new genetics allowed for greater productivity on both intensivity scale and extensivity. At the time of the two major world wars, here we're considering the second one, the US became a global power, meaning that the logistics of how you get armament and materials all around the world was something that the US learned how to do at that period of time. The resources such as, for instance, insecticides coming from biological warfare tools, fertilizers coming from bombing technology developed for those wars, essentially were turned into agricultural purposes. And it all came together so that now we can show charts like this. We applied all of that, which was gathered over a period of about a century, and turned it into this. Now, you may think that this would only be of interest to agricultural scientists. You folks are about other business in other parts of the food system. This is a very nice little proxy for our food system. Let me illustrate it to you this way. Some of us, so I heard a few laughs there. A few of us are kind of dating ourselves. Does anybody recognize the apparatus here? Yes. The food replicator. So, the way that the food replicator works is a bit controversial because it was explained differently by the time this series of Star Trek occurred than when the original series of Star Trek occurred. So I'll give you the original. So the original was that it worked like this. In the hull of the Starship Enterprise, there is this paste formulated by dietitians. It was formulated so that it perfectly met all of human dietary needs. And so you walked up to the replicator and you said, I would like beefsteak, or I would like spaghetti. And you'd punch a few buttons or just speak to the thing, it'd go boop, boop. And essentially what it would do is bring up from the hull of the ship this paste. It would shape it, moisturize it, texturize it, flavor it so that it looked like chicken parmesan or whatever it is that you asked for, and there it was. So this is how you could walk up to the Starship Enterprise and food replicator and get whatever you want. Well, here's actually the result today. This is a 3D printing of an Enterprise scallop done by colleagues at Cornell University, where in essence, right now the state of 3D printing is if you have solid state of one single material, you can manufacture what you want. And they manufactured this so that it was actually fried to begin with. So the corn soy system, and this was their source material, is essentially our food replicator. It is essentially the gunk that gets shaped, moisturized, texturized, flavored, and turned into anything you want that you consider to food. Your Pringles, your soft drinks, your burgers, you name it, this is where it's coming from. So it's a nice little proxy for what our food system does, and more seriously, where our resources go, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So I want to focus on this period here where it looks like nothing's happening, because that was determinative in terms of many realities of the food system at the moment. Because in fact, what is happening there, if we look more carefully, is that there was tremendous variability in production. Now, this is not misdirection. There is a lot of variability after that, but production levels are much higher. In the early teens, so in the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, that yield variability meant you either survived or you didn't. So it was a totally different proposition. So I want to talk to you about some of the things that we did intentionally in order to get away from that reality. So we're going to start out with a particular federal policy that most people would not go to as the beginning of agricultural policy, but for reasons I just mentioned, the very helpfully named, very transparent Indian Removal Act, I think it's a very good precedent for the way in which the agricultural power of the country was established. It occurred out east, but it essentially set the precedent for what was going to happen in the Midwest, when in the 1860s, the Homestead Act, also something enacted by Lincoln, was put into place. You're familiar with it. Actually, many of you are probably descended of folks that came because they were homesteaders. You know, you'd get a 160-acre tract. If you took care of it for 5 years, then it was yours. And so this land was populated in that way on appropriated land. By 1933, we had the establishment of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Now, the Agricultural Adjustment Act is pointed to by many folks as the very first iteration of what today is referred to as the Farm Bill. I'll just mention to you that it was established by President Roosevelt soon after he was elected. And here's an important theme. The issue that he was trying to address was actually overproduction. Farmers in this area, the majority of folks were out here, the majority of farmers were out here, were suffering through cycles of boom and bust. And when they had boom, their prices would go down. And this was a disaster. And so there were a number of experiments in federal policy set up with the intent of actually taking care of the quality of life of folks in the rural environment. And that meant increasing their income so that they were comparable to those of folks living on the East Coast. And so a series of acts were put into place. This particular act was actually contested, that 1933 act. Actually, this act is actually suppressed. Every 5 years, it's canceled and replaced whatever the new iteration of the Farm Bill is. And if the Farm Bill is not approved, then in theory, we go back to that original act. And the reason why it was severely contested at that period of time was that it was seen as socialism. Roosevelt was seen as a socialist. And so this cartoon there is much too small for you to see, but you see that the Farm Bill is depicted as a steamroller, and what it's rolling over, these individuals are carrying little rolls of paper that say such things as the nation's free enterprise system, the nation's fiscal budget, and so on. So there were a lot of sources of opposition to what was seen as socialism on behalf of supporting farmers in the Midwest. And before that died down, there was a calamity in the Midwest, which is in essence the Dust Bowl years. So then, a number of different things were put together to craft federal policy, a pattern that exists to this day. And in that particular case, what was put together was the argument that, well, we're not just giving money to folks producing food for no reason. What we're doing is asking them to conserve our resources so that we'll prevent future disasters, future calamities, like the one that was experienced in the middle of the 1930s. And that particular premise, that in exchange for support of farmers' well-being, they will take care of natural resources, is being contested to this very day. If you follow Farm Bill policy, you know that that's one of the underlying dynamics. But that was introduced at this period of time. Now, we need to speed up here. This is really not the place to get into the details of this, although they're very delicious, but I'm going to actually stop and talk about maybe a couple of them that are very important. In the early 1960s, the preoccupation was the overproduction, the overcapacity of the agricultural system. And explicitly, the worry in DC was, how do you actually move folks off of the farm and get them into cities? So overproduction has been a theme of how you manage the agricultural economy and the agricultural situation in the United States. The court struck down efforts to limit supply as illegal. And so in essence, where we've ended up is attempting to manage demand. So since farmers will continue to produce more, the more demand there is, talk to an economist about the Jevons effect, then in essence, we've had a sequence of different gimmicks in order to sop up that tremendous productive capacity of the Midwest. So many of you will know that the original reason for school food programs was that, to sop up the tremendous surplus. Many of you will know that Food for Peace, you know, Ersatz foreign aid was an effort to do exactly that same sort of thing. Biofuels, another example to do exactly the same sort of thing. The list is long. The issue is we can produce, and we are going to produce, therefore what are we going to do with the stuff that we're producing? So this is one area that I wanted to emphasize. The other area that I want to emphasize, because we're going to come back to this, was in 1977, the integration of the earlier Food Stamp Act into agricultural policy. We'll have a lot to say about that in just a little bit. And then the establishment of the North American Free Trade Accord at the end of the Clinton years, which was not part of the Farm Bill, but which had huge impact on agricultural economies. And I'll come back and talk about this a little bit more. Where we are at the moment is basically trying to sort out how much of the excess capacity is going to be devoted to the production of biofuels. And more specifically at the moment, we're contesting whether we actually want to deal with poverty by making people poorer, which is the explicit outcome of many policies being decided in DC, and what role federal farm policy is going to have in this, if at all. Specifically, who are going to be the beneficiaries of all of our collective effort? The commissioner mentioned that public health is a result of collective effort. Here we have a situation in the Farm Bill, as in many other cases, where in essence the collective wealth is being concentrated in a specific sector. It's not really benefiting the collectivity of the public. It's a huge issue for this nation. If nothing else is gathered from that real quick survey, too quick really, of farm policy, again I'll come to the punchline. We created the reality that we have at the moment. And it looks like this. This is in essence the map of how we support the present structure of agriculture. It is no accident that we have the kind of agricultural system that we have at the moment. We support it, we prop it up. And if there are failures of any kind, whether they are market failures, whether they are natural failures, storms, and so on, we make sure that we indemnify our farmers. They cannot fail in this part of the country. We take care of them. And so this is an investment that the nation is making in supporting that particular food system, the corn-soy food system. Remember, equate that, at least I'm arguing, to the pap that we can process into anything that we want. Now, in continuing with this theme, going back to the fact that when we are talking about food security, we're talking about access to resources, and that it matters because this is not just a free market outcome that I'm describing here. This is actually an explicit investment of public treasure to create the reality that I've just described. Let's talk about the underlying natural science, if you will, what the actual flows are that we are managing. So I'll go through this very quickly, but what you see here is the Piedmont of a mountain region where you see that in essence, geological forces, rainfall over eons have essentially scrubbed the highlands and then concentrated in that Piedmont area the organic matter, the sediment, and this is where we learn to perform agriculture, essentially just intercepting that flow of water, organic matter, fertility, and natural resources. And at the present, we do exactly the same sort of thing, except we don't just happily come across a river delta where natural forces are doing that, whether human beings are there to intercept those flows or not, or in Piedmonts. We actually create our own virtual deltas, or our own virtual Piedmonts. And so what this means is basically an iteration on what we've already covered. We are wealthy, we are powerful. We can command the resources of the world to flow to us. Because behind the food system that does that is the production system that does this. So this means we control the flow of water so that we can produce our food. We control the flow of the fossil fuels. We control the flow of potash, of fixed nitrogen, of phosphorus, and all of the resources that are required in order for this tremendous productivity to occur. And that means that we have a huge footprint extending beyond the particular area here. So in some of the research that I did into this while at Iowa State, conservatively, we were able to calculate that you need to deflate yields in this area by 25%, that's corn-soy integrated, to account for that extended footprint of all of these resources. So we overstate the productivity because we don't take into account that someplace, somewhere, we're getting all of these additional resources. And how long can this continue? Well, as long as we can continue to control the supply chain of potash. There's several different very famous holes in the world, a couple here, actually 3 here in the United States, 1 in southern Canada, 1 in South America, there's a couple in Africa for potash, very important holes. Very big hole for phosphorus, actually almost all of the phosphorus is in Western Africa, and controlling access to that supply is particularly important because there is no substitute for this stuff. And right now, depending on how quickly China comes online, setting up their McDonald's and the whole supply chain behind that, the supply of this stuff may be 300 years to as little as 50 years, depending again on how quickly they emulate the system that I've just described. So as long as we can control those supplies, we can continue to, quote, enjoy the food system as just described. All this requires tremendous amounts of energy. So how long can this system go on? Well, as long as we can control the supply of the fossil fuel and continue to squeeze out there's a technical point here. You know, it turns out that it's fairly likely that there's a tremendous amount of fossil fuel that we can get beyond the era that we're in right now. And folks that are in this are essentially telling us that the stuff that we've exploited up until now is the stuff that literally jumped out of the ground and slapped you in the face, and the stuff that we will be going after for about maybe 600 years, according to their estimates, is the stuff where you actually have to work very hard to get at it, but there's a tremendous supply there. So therefore, the battle is on for how to control access to that source of energy, without which none of the rest of what I'm talking about is possible. So I hope I'm being transparent here that this particular analysis of what appears to be just a benign activity, supplying the food so that people can be nourished, so we can carry on, you know, being nurses and doctors and lawyers and so on, is an exercise of power. It's an exercise of control over the planet's finite resources. And there are winners and there are losers in this contest. So we shouldn't dissemble when we talk about the food access issue. When we are talking about hunger, we're talking about poverty. When we're talking about poverty, we're talking about the losers in that contest among the wealthy and the powerful of the world and those that are not so. Now, one last thing that I want to mention before we go into what I hope are a series of more pleasant topics here is an explanation for why this is possible. Now, I mentioned that each one of us is very powerful, and we are. I mean, you can decide what it is that you want to eat in 2 hours when you get out of here, whenever you're liberated from here, you can stretch a little bit and say, well, what do I feel like? And whatever it is that you want, you can have. And the reason is that there's not just you. The reason is that there's 310 million of us. And so between the 310 million of us, we can generate that sort of collective power that allows us to command all of those resources to flow to us. And the turning point here, the point where actually half of us were on the land and half of us were urban dwellers, comes in about the 1920s. So these may appear to be random dates. I want to come back and tie them together for you. So let's take a look at the outcome of this. And we'll do this in a systemic way. For an engineer, a system is a set of parts that are coordinated to work in a particular way that they produce a specified outcome. So here's the agricultural system of the Midwest, and one that farmers very appropriately are quite proud of. And they will tell you such things as that Kant that I just described, that doxology. You can actually just repeat it with me. The result of this is the most abundant, safest, most affordable food system in the world. Quite right, for a few of us. Here's another way of taking a look at exactly those same parts, coordinated so that they're producing a particular outcome. And so we'll do a little bit of Groundhog Day on this theme. So this very system, functioning in exactly the same way, produces a number of different outcomes. So here's the outcome where you could think of no more efficient way to transport the soil and phosphate and nitrate runoff from the upper Midwest and deposit it at the mouth of the Mississippi to create algal blooms that then sop up the oxygen in the surface waters of the Atchafalaya Basin and therefore starve aerobic organisms in that area. And it's a very visible phenomenon measured every year by Nancy Rabelais of the Louisiana University Marine Consortium. And so this is the vast area that is actually washed. And if you do not think this is work, just think of what it would take to use excavators, barges, and all kinds of machinery that you can think of to produce exactly the same outcome. So this is the outcome of that system. And again, it's exactly the same parts working in exactly the same way as I described that first system, but they're producing this outcome. So let's go back to Groundhog Day and take a look at another outcome. And this is where I'll reach back and talk to you about the establishment of the North American Free Trade Agreement in the 90s. There are probably many of you in the room who, together with me and several others at that time, could see that what that treaty was going to do was to actually impoverish corn farmers throughout Mexico and Central America, and that there would be consequences for that. And as a matter of fact, here's one of those consequences. Because this is one way that you could describe exactly that same system, those same parts working in coordination to produce a particular outcome, is that it displaced people from southern Mexico and Central America and then concentrated them around meat plants throughout the Midwest. So I once did a survey, actually 2 years in a row, I did a survey with my students. So, they were a captured audience, not a systematic study, I'm not claiming that, but I just surveyed them. I was curious. Heart of Gold Iowa students, and I asked them this question: what salary would it take for you to work in a meat plant? And what do you think I got back? What dollar figure do you think I got back? There were very few students that actually gave me a dollar figure. And by and large, in different words, what they said was, that is not work that I will do. I mean, we just won't deign to do that sort of work. I had one particularly honest student that wrote down on the survey that is Mexican work. And so, he was very, very clear about the way in which the economy of this particular system works. But it is an outcome of the way that the system is structured, and it is an outcome of policy. So again, I'll repeat the theme. We created this system. It is one thing to say we did not intend for these things to occur, therefore we cannot be blamed for outcomes that were not our intention. That is very fair. But for the long list of things that I've been covering here, now knowing those things, going all the way back to appropriating land and all of these resources and these particular kinds of outcomes, which are outright exploitation, then it cannot be excused to say that it is still okay. And so it is up to all of us to reform that. We're better than this. This is not the kind of country I don't think anyone wants to be a part of here. And I'll come back to this when talking about how we can get a food utopia out of what I'm describing clearly as a dystopia. All of the parts for things to be good, and yet we have these very serious issues. And this is, I think, what brings a large number of you into the room. This is where all of you can tell me more than the reverse. Here are the #1 killers in the United States. 4 out of the leading 10 are related to the way in which we eat. So it's a tremendously productive system, very bountiful without doubt, and it's killing us. So I don't need to go into the details with this particular crowd, and actually we don't have the time to go into it, but I do want to illustrate an example of how this system works, because again, without the proper diagnosis, we can't get the right prescription. And this is an area where, at least by my lights, I see that there's a lot of misinterpretation about the way that the system works. So this is a picture that many of you probably have used yourselves. These are a couple of young gentlemen photographed in a McDonald's in London a few years ago, clearly too young to have made many choices, and clearly just a reflection of the food environment around them. So basically everything from their parents, their school, their church, the entire commercial environment around them, that this is what it produced in them in combination with their genes, obviously. And so let's talk about that system explicitly. Now, McDonald's is just handy, and it would be foolish to try to hide, it was their restaurant that we're talking about them. So I'm not particularly picking on them, but this is a nice example. It's a very germane example. So let's talk about this. You're all experts in this. Let's go to McDonald's. I'm not going to teach you anything here, but I just want to go through there, and I want us to be explicit about our reasoning process. So let's suppose that we step into McDonald's. Remember, I made the argument earlier, when we do that, it's really because we're trying to save time. We've said something like, I need to be there in 35 minutes. Let's see, it takes me 10 minutes to get there. Oh my God, I've got 15 minutes to grab something to eat. What am I going to do? And so, there's a food swamp, just like the commissioner mentioned, that you will drive down. I don't know Duluth. I imagine there's a strip someplace where there's tons of these things. So you just drive down, probably just go through the drive-thru even. But anyway, let's pretend that you actually take the effort to walk in. So you're all experts at this. So let's do this here. So, you walk in, and you're looking up there. And so let's take a look at number 4 there. Look. You can get, for $3.18, 2 cheeseburgers. But for $5.29, you can get the meal, the fries and the soft drink with that. Now, let's suppose that you're trapped. Let's suppose that I'm looking around the room, you all take care of yourselves, so you're determined that you're going to have a healthy meal. So problem number one is you walked into a McDonald's, but you're determined. And so, you scan around. Okay, there's this stuff. What can I possibly do? Ah, there it is. So you look over there, and there's the salads. Okay, let me go for the cheapest salad there, $4.69. And we just have to say, they're trying their best. You remember, right? I'm not picking on them, but the economics of this are, right now at least, that's not moving off the shelves. So it's prepackaged, it's frozen up on the top. They'll have the higher quality lettuces, but then there'll be iceberg underneath that. And this is not your idea of something that's going to be a flavorful, enjoyable meal when compared to the piping hot, comfort food that's over on the other menu there. But let's say you're really determined. This is good for you. So let's go for that cheaper one, the Caesar salad there, $4.69. But wait a minute, that's all I get. I just get that. If I wanted to get at least something to drink, then I have to pay more. So as opposed to that bargain that I get with the super meal over there, and I come over here, let's say that I'm going to get a soft drink. And I go for the smallest one, it's $1.49. Now I'm paying about $1.50 more for this salad. It's got wilty stuff down on the bottom there, and it's this frozen salad, and there's this piping hot meal there that in an instant is just going to come out. It isn't just that. It's this case that you would be paying more to get less, and that's un-American. Because, just take a look at this. $1.49, that's the small drink. But for just 20 cents more, you can get the medium drink. And for 20 cents more than that, you can get a tub. So who walks into a McDonald's and asks for a small? You feel stupid. You feel like an idiot. Right? And it's intentionally actually structured that way. So there are some very deliberate choices, quote choices, that are already made for us when you attempt to interact with this system that have to do with the false economy behind what we create an abundance of and therefore artificially lower prices. You create this economic monster where the more processed something is, the cheaper it is. Which makes no economic sense. So again, all of these are things that we can change. Now, my friend here has just reminded me I better hurry up, so I'm going to skip by stuff that is just common knowledge to you. The point here being that there's a tremendous cost to this. This is our treasure. This is our tax money. Therefore, this is not a critique of the market. This is a critique of how we get to use our own money. Is this a definition of what the commissioner mentioned, our collectively acting to create the greatest public well-being? So I won't go into the details of this. Again, you folks are actually experts here because I want to get into how we can actually get to a food utopia here. It may seem like we've actually put ourselves into a corner and there is no way, but I've got some suggestions here. But I promise you that we'd come back and deconstruct this. And so let's do this as quickly as I can. Whenever you take a look at a figure like this, a percentage is a ratio. And in this case, it actually is just a simple ratio, a numerator and a denominator. So the error here is something quite similar to what would happen if I walked up to you, I was all very proud of myself, and I said, I'm very fast. And I'm very fast because I can run in 8 minutes. And you're saying, well, okay, but what's missing? What distance are we talking about? So when we say that it takes 9% of our income in order to meet our family food needs, there's a very important figure missing there. If you're going to have a small quotient, either you have a small numerator or a big denominator or both. And most of us do the fuzzy thinking, the Daniel Kahneman's fast thinking, because it hurts to do slow, careful thinking. So we just say, it must be that there's a teeny numerator here. It must be that, the food is very cheap. So which is it? So let's have a look at income growth. And here's what income growth has done over exactly the same period of time. It looks like that. It's grown so that when you do the obvious calculus of what the absolute cost of food has been over that period of time, it actually is held at around a little bit over $5,000 per family per year. Now, $5,000 for actual food costs, and remember, if you'll just allow me to use rounded numbers here. If if we take that as 5% of the total income of an American family, you saw from that previous graph, we're talking about a median income, an average income actually in the United States of $50,000. So we're very wealthy. The answer there is that we're very wealthy, not that our food is cheap. And let's actually just drive a point home. And we can do this very easily by doing some global comparisons. So for the United States, here's what household income looks like against the percentage that we spend for food. So that's what we've been discussing here. Now, let's do a real quick comparison. Well, this populates, let me just tell you that these are all calibrated so that the diet that is being provided is the FAO recommended diet based on calories. So, it's not a complete accounting for proper nourishment, but based on calories, these are calibrated at that level. So you see that actually almost everyone else can eat for less than Americans can. And as a matter of fact, some of you are probably experts in this following fact. The reality is that these are the dollar figures that we actually spend, the absolute dollar figures that we spend on an annual basis per family. But in the United States, we actually have the luxury that we can actually throw away almost half of it. Depending on whose studies you're looking at it, a nice figure to use is 40% that we throw away. And depending on where in the world and even where in the United States you look at, the majority of that waste may be in production in the field. For the majority of us, it's actually the waste that occurs in the actual retail channel and in our homes. And so, we have the luxury that here it costs us all of this, and then we can throw it away. And do a simple calculation here. So, let's just round figures. $5,000 that we're spending annually, and we throw away 40% of it, that's $2,000 that we just don't think of. The bananas went overripe on us, we throw them away. And, those $4,000, divide that into the annual cost for feeding a family in Kenya. What it means is that your trash can is eating better than 8 families in Kenya do on an annual basis. Your trash can. So there's like 20 different lessons here, but hopefully the one thing none of us will ever go around saying is that our food is cheap, but that we are wasteful in an unconscionable way. Because everything that I've just described almost is unconscionable, and then the end product of that, we throw 40% of it away. So obviously there's many things that we can do to improve. So let's get to this. In order to understand the system, it's a 1.3 trillion system. You can think of it as $1.3 trillion that say it's going to stay the same. That's the economic interest in getting us to be fat, getting us to be sick, getting us to buy more of the wrong stuff. The farm value of that is 19%, and nobody is getting away with anything because when you pair up the value here, in fact, as I've said many times, we're paying for the convenience. And so really it's all the processing, the manufacturing, the transportation, all of that that accounts for the value. Now, because I have a friend here that's hurrying me along, I'm not going to get into this here. I'm just going to jump to the punchline of how we can get to the Utopia bit. So bear with me. When I was at the Kellogg Foundation, we actually thought about the kind of food system that we wanted to support. And we referred to this as a good food system. And when we thought about what made up a good food system, we identified 4 characteristics that needed to be satisfied simultaneously. The first one is almost embarrassing to have to specify, and that is that your food should nourish you and it should be wholesome. If you eat it over the course of your lifetime, it should not make you sick. Overweight, diabetic, hypertense, kill you of a heart attack. And it should not poison you. There should not be toxins in it, and so on. Again, embarrassing that you should even have to say that, but criterion number 1, it should be healthy. And it should not exploit nature. In other words, it should not be self-limiting. It should not be bounded in time, because we eat well now should not mean that others cannot eat well in the future. And it should not exploit people either. And ultimately, the outcome of that should not be precious food, accessible to only a few of us. And so these 4 characteristics met simultaneously are what we refer to as the good food system, and we wanted more of this. So let me suggest a few ways in which we can get to this good food system. So particularly for those that can't access that wasteful, unconscionable system that I just described, because we can't just flick a switch and transform that system. So when you take a look at this and go back to the original story about the brass and access to factors of production, I want to remind you of a principle of organizing, which is that you do what you can with what you got right now. And I want to redefine for you a system that for many of us is known as a CSA and recast it for you. It is a different way of buyers and producers sharing factors of production. And it is woefully both misunderstood and woefully practiced at present. But it could be a tremendous example, along with food co-ops and other examples, of ways in which you can change the relationship between owners of factor production and actually bend the system to meet the needs of actual eaters so that the food is healthy, green, fair, and affordable. You can speak that way to this scale of a system. Now, obviously, we're not all going to be participating in CSAs to meet all of our food needs, and so there are also other scales of production, and you're familiar with this one. There are farmers markets that have greater capacity because there's a little bit more aggregation of the supply there. And due to lack of time, I won't actually expand on this example, but the same logic applies. At this scale, we can influence in a completely different way people that we know, farmland that we are familiar with, and actually have a hope of producing a system that has different characteristics. Same argument can be made for food hubs, which is essentially taking this same model of aggregating and consolidating, but then meeting the needs of schools with good food, as opposed to the industrial system that I've just been describing. Now, because I've been given the signal to wrap it up here, let me do this very quickly. What we've been doing at the Union of Concerned Scientists is working at the policy level to send resources in such a way that we support farm to school, farm to institution, farmers markets, CSAs, local and regional food systems. And I wish that I had the time to go through this example in detail, but it's essentially making the argument that you don't need to listen to us wild-eyed foodies. You just need to follow the recommendations of the USDA, which say half of your plate, on my plate, needs to be fruits and vegetables. If we actually ate that way, we would create 189,000 new jobs that don't exist at the moment. Thank you. And we would create $9.5 billion of wealth that don't exist at the moment. Now, this was done by our agricultural economist and our senior economist. And for those of you that are not familiar with economic analysis, let me just ask you a question that I know is at the back of your mind. This is a winners and losers analysis. In other words, when you actually make it possible for farmers that are currently producing something else to respond to greater demand for fruits and vegetables, then there's going to be less production, let's say, of cereals, less production of meat. You have to take into account that economic loss. And so this is fully taken into account, all of those markets, what is gained, what is lost. And so the net is 189,000 new jobs, 9.5 billion in terms of local economic development. And of course, the system is not frictionless. We're recommending policies that actually favor and incentivize the establishment of farmers markets. You've all seen the news that after a low of about maybe 700 of them back in the 70s, we're now back up to about 8,000 of them. So policies that actually favor and incentivize both the establishment of those farmers markets and the economic activity within those markets and access by folks that normally wouldn't be able to buy fruits and vegetables directly from the farmer at those markets are the sorts of policies that we're advocating. And yes, they will cost, and here's what they will cost. So compared to the $5 billion annually that we spend on average, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, scores this on a 10-year basis, and so annually it comes to $5 billion to support the corn-soy system with all of the features that I've just been describing. For a $90 million investment, which over time should decrease, we can get the two benefits that I just described. So just one example of the sorts of policy advocacy that we're doing. And what we have in mind is something like this. Many of you probably would not recognize this, but if any of you recognize the D5 conference that I mentioned up front, if you're techies, you may recognize this as a topological map of the internet. And you may know that the internet was actually designed so that it could be a network of maximum resilience. The specification that was given by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency that actually put out bids for this system was that it should survive thermonuclear war. So if you actually interrupted the function of one part of the system, it should reconstitute and be able to continue to supply information. And we're arguing that the same sort of logic applies to food systems, that the most resilient system is the one that's made up of lots of little nodes that can individually respond to conditions, and that wouldn't be susceptible to global holocaust. And of course, that's putting it a little bit too strongly, but probably maybe every third week, you will hear about the outbreak du jour of listeria, of botulism, of this or that, another infection that gets into one part of the system, and it propagates over a vast region of the United States before we can even surveil to figure out what happened, and then react and try to recall that food. So this would contain that, and with that same kind of resilience. So obviously we need to undo a knot, very complicated knot. And so we have some very specific suggestions for how to undo the American food system in a constructive way. And I'll just remind you that the system has $1.3 trillion of economic interest saying it's going to stay this way. And I'm just going to go to some basic principles of the country, basic unfinished business of the country, the land of freedom, the land of opportunity. Let me show you the income inequality trend for the USA. If you have followed, if you grant my logic that when we're talking about lack of food access, we're talking about poverty, then income inequality is central to understanding why we have it. And all of you are probably experts in the fact that we are living in a period of inequality such as we have never experienced in this country. It is increasing dramatically. So, this is a graph that, without getting into the technicalities, demonstrates that basically there is a connection between lack of opportunity and that inequality. The reason why I'm being rushed along here is that our organizers want to maximize Q&A, and so if you're interested about this, we can talk about this more in Q&A. But I want to get to how you actually can deal with this, because there are countries in the world that know how to deal with this. This is not a mystery. And I'll illustrate this with one study out of England. The researchers are Wilkinson and Pickett. They came up with an index of health and social problems. So this index is a composite index of all of the things that we would need to improve in order for us to enjoy maximal well-being. So what their index looks like is something like this. If on an axis you have income inequality going from low to high, and then you compare that against that composite index that I've just described, what you have is this very strong relationship among the nations, such as the greater income inequality, and you notice the country that's up at the top of that ranking, then the worse our health and social problems are. And as a matter of fact, this was so suggestive to them, they decided that they would do it just within the United States for the 50 states of the Union. And here's New Hampshire, here's Iowa, here's Utah, there's Wisconsin, places where there's relatively low income inequality and there's a pretty good index of health and social problems. And then here are places where there's a lot of inequality in the United States. There's Alabama, there's California, there's Texas, there's Florida. It's not an accident that there's a lot of income inequality in these places for the reasons that we've just described. There's Kentucky. And here's the whole cloud of all the states, and there you are. I know you're curious. So here, the relationship is 75% of the entire relationship is explained with only a 5% chance that that's due to coincidence. So there's a very strong relationship here. And obviously what this tells us, when you translate this into English, the meaning is this. As people in Costa Rica, Norway, Sweden, Finland know, the more we invest in each other, the better off we all are. That's actually the principle, supposedly, on which this country was founded, with the little distortion that immediately the country expended tremendous energy keeping a fraction of its population enslaved and didn't really finish taking care of that business. I'm arguing, until now, we're still dealing with that question. The British like to say of Americans that they don't have a sense of irony about that particular fact. So, food utopia. Let me give you a story here. I think the things that I'm suggesting here are possible to do. mostly because I think it's possible for people to begin with what they've got now and come up with these alternative food systems on a local and regional basis that will actually outshine and outperform the system that is going to implode for all of the reasons that I described. And I'd like to give you a little bit of incentive for this by just sharing with you that there's multiple drivers that need to occur. I was speaking recently with a political scientist at Demos in DC, and Michael Lipsky, if you're interested in following up, who essentially told me, you cannot order up a social movement, a dramatic transformation of the sort that you're talking. Civil rights, women's suffrage, all of these examples that we point to were long movements. A lot of pieces were in motion, like boiling water, where it looks like for 10 or 15 minutes, nothing is happening. And then all of a sudden, things begin to bubble. You can't order that up. But what he finds to be important is that there are lots of people that actually agree with all of the sorts of things that we're talking about here. The foodies in the crowd, the public health people in the crowd, the farm to school people in the crowd. There are folks out there that agree with all these sorts of things, and they agree with us, and they don't know it. They don't know that there's a movement. They don't know that they can work together in order to change the reality collectively, as the commissioner has said. So 4 different places where we see that at the Union of Concerned Scientists that there must be operating simultaneously and together. We're working on the policy drivers. That's the envelope that creates the realities within which the rest of us can operate. There must be a public health envelope. We can't continue to do things that make us sick. We must equate the worst cases within the food system with what occurred, say, with tobacco. It is that serious. Another driver is corporate responsibility. I didn't get a chance to get into that, but in essence, that's where American democracy has been sabotaged. You can think of issues such as gun rights, immigration, a number of issues where the will of the people is not accurately being represented by electeds in DC. And so corporate responsibility and that sabotage of the democratic process needs to be taken care of. And equity issues need to be taken care of. They are fundamental. These 4 drivers need to be operated in tangent. And here's where I want to hopefully inspire you. It'll be, that can't be commanded, but this is my observation. So I wasn't born in the United States. I came when I was a teenager. And so it still happens to me that I catch myself looking at the United States and at Americans as a teenage boy, as a foreigner. And here's the thing about Americans that is constant, and that is Americans are never happy. So you just finished painting that front porch, and the paint is not dry, and you cannot enjoy it because you're saying, I shouldn't have chosen that color. Or you've just done the addition, and you can't sit in your easy chair and enjoy the addition because already you've thought, I shouldn't have done it that way. This material should have been that way, or this dimension should have been that way. You're already thinking about how it's going to be better next time. So let's do that for this food system. It is a food system that has been successful in many counts. Lincoln accomplished a lot. He eliminated drudgery. We've licked scale. We've licked productivity. And the most American thing to do is to say, and that is not enough. We need to continue working to make it healthy, green, fair, affordable. Thank you. So I don't know whether I ate up all of the Q&A time, Tiki. Okay, you're the boss, so how much time are we going to take here? Okay, so Tiki says we have 10 minutes here for questions, and there's no guarantee of answers. Yeah, no, obviously that is true. So the question, if I understand it, is that it has to be taken into account that family size has decreased over that historical period of time that we talked about. So that obviously it really does mean that the food cost has increased per individual within the family. Yes, absolutely true. It's a nice refinement.
Hi, Ricardo. This is Cassie from Blue Cross. You talked about food as a social movement and what's needed in social movements. And one of the things that we see across social movements is building leadership for that movement, and that's the focus of this gathering. And so I wonder what you think we're doing well in building leadership for the food movement, and maybe where we need to strengthen our work.
That's an excellent question. And actually, full disclosure here, Cassie and I know each other really well. And actually, I think Cassie is one of those people that's an example of what needs to be happening with food system leadership. And if I think of your example, Cassie, you had an individual interest that you pursued wherever it took you, even going to study at such a place as Iowa State, which is probably a very foreign notion to you at some time in your life. But I would guess that actually buying the cred that comes from studying at a four-square Midwestern land-grant university, and the fact that it gets you into conversations where normally these views would not be expressed, and acquiring the skills to articulate these views in a way that they can be heard, coupled with ideas for improvement, are all part of being a leader, as distinguished from another very important part of any movement, which is essentially to be the rabble that's expanding, the margin of what needs to be addressed. But when you actually get to the point where you're providing leadership, you need to have ideas. You need to state them in a way that can be both acted upon, that others can hear. And obviously, if that's done well, then people are inspired to do that. And I think venues like this are the perfect place to do that. But it's not the only venue. We nourish each other at places like this. Schools, particularly, where we're fighting against the current, are another important place for us to invest our energy to do that. And social institutions in general, whether it be hospitals, whether it be churches, and so on. Those are the places where that kind of leadership can be expressed. And I actually would be very interested in other ideas around that as well. We need a lot more of that, definitely in the policy world in DC.
Question. Education about healthy food seems to be something that is really needed to say, well, this is why you need something that's less calorically rich and more nutritionally rich. And I was wondering if you had any shining examples of great locally based education systems that have reached out to people with low access and kind of taught how to utilize a rutabaga or kale or Swiss chard or some of these really healthy things that are basically foreign languages to a lot of us.
Yeah. Boy, just from some of the people that I know in the crowd, there are far better people in here to address that. But I can say a couple things about that. One is that, to answer your question directly, I know of some programs like that. So for instance, many of you may be familiar with the program that is called Food Corps, or similar programs. There's a program that's called School Food Focus. And let me tell you the Food Corps story. There is a little bit of a background story to Food Corps that needs to be understood, because the quick answer to your question, if we just wanted to move on, was to say there's this group that's called Food Corps. They do that, and we're done. And what it is, it's a volunteer program. It's supported by AmeriCorps with dollars matched by private foundations. And it's more important to understand this. Food Corps was the brilliant result of the rolling out of a movie called King Corn that many of you in the room may be familiar with, by a couple of young videographers from the East Coast. Even though they had Midwestern roots, they were from the East Coast. And their whole premise for the movie was that they wanted to understand, they were trying to imitate Michael Pollan, who'd done this story about following a steer from where it was produced in a Midwestern feedlot to how it got to his plate in New York City. They wanted to do the same thing for corn. And they had such a learning discovery that, I exaggerate not one bit, they had such a learning and also such skill that they turned a topic that is deadly. I mean, I can't think of anything more boring than agricultural policy. And they turned that into an exciting movie, where I sat in the room with young people, and when that movie was done, they said, how can this be? What can we do? So what these videographers did was that they recreated that energy in church basements, in school auditoriums, and in small venues, 20, 15 people at a time, throughout the Midwest primarily, but throughout the entire country. And when they did that, a lot of those energized people would come up to them, and they would be school teachers, and they would say stuff like, I love what you're saying, I wish I could do a school garden, I wish I could help, with this issue, but I'm a mathematician. I don't know anything about this, and even if I knew something, I don't have the time. I have to deal with my curriculum planning and so on. And then they would also get young college students, and they would say, man, this is what I want to do, but where do I go? What do I do? So they put those two things together and created Food Corps, which is essentially a kind of a Vista volunteers model where they match the energy of young people that wanted to improve the food system by volunteering in schools, and then schools that could actually place them and use them to teach the sorts of skills that you're talking about, with the logic being that in the formative years, you can actually battle the cultural forces, the commercial forces that make it so that our idea of a good meal is the fried, warm, crispy stuff that we're talking about here, and acquire the sorts of insight and knowledge that you described. So that's one good program that I know of that does that as well. School Food Focus is another one that operates maybe not as explicitly, but I understand your question, and this is an outer shell of the question. Really, we could circumvent that. That's a bit of work, and that's also a bit of missionary work. But the idea of groups like School Food Focus and others is that if we could just create the default environment where, again, when you're not thinking and you just say, I'm hungry, what is there to eat? And your food environment consists of this sort of stuff. And it's just, from the time that we were young, and all of the institutions and all of the commercial forces around us just teach us. It's the salads, it's the rutabagas, it's all the stuff that you're talking about. And that would be a different vision of food utopia. And they're doing this by essentially getting into schools and providing better alternatives so that when school kids form their idea of what good food is, it's based on being exposed to high quality food when they were young.
To what extent do you think transportation systems are a solution to food access?
Well, I'm not sure. So can you say a little bit more about why you're curious about that?
Well, you spoke of a food desert and a food swamp, and I was just thinking that if people that were living in a food desert had cheap public transportation accessible to them, they could go where the good food is. Or the other side of the coin would be, and we just had a presentation on this the other day by the Intertribal Ag Council representative about the possibility of mobile markets. In other words, bringing good food to people that are otherwise isolated.
Yeah, I've been part of a few experiments like this, and unfortunately, because we're out of time here, I'm going to have to give this the short shrift. So if you go with my premise, if we're talking about lack of food access, and this is a proxy for being poor, we're talking about low capital resources, but that doesn't say anything about other assets or resources that a community or group of people may have. So a food desert is what food purveyors do to you. That's the reality that they create around you. So if we get around the mentality of feeding others, or the feeding the world doxology, and actually just start out by saying we can take care of ourselves with the assets that are available to us, it will look ridiculous to the folks who think that the only food system that matters is the one that transports food halfway around the world. But if it does the job of producing fruits and vegetables for a family or a group of families, that's where you start. And again, because I don't have enough time, I'll just give you, this may even seem like an out-of-place example. I hurt for my daughter who's just beginning her career because she has a feature phone and not a smartphone. I could buy her a smartphone, make me feel a whole lot better about the fact I could always find her. She can text me at any time. She can find directions wherever she is, all that sort of stuff. But if I give her the phone and she doesn't have the money to pay the $150 every month, nobody's really being helped here. And so the issue is, how do you address with the actual assets that the individual community has, work to build up from those, which was kind of the idea that I see I didn't do full justice to. Talking about beginning with utilizing the resources that you have at your disposal through CSAs, through farmers markets, the local and regional assets, and build up your food systems that way. Transportation will always be important, but if I understand the gist of your question, we should not begin with the premise that the way you're going to address this is literally to take somebody else's productivity and be a missionary, a food missionary, as a permanent solution. It's very important, as most people in this room know, to deal with acute emergencies, but that's not a permanent long-term way to address the food access issue. And I think we are out of time, right?
Question.
Oh, one more? Okay.
Yeah. So it seems like whether it's on the health end, so obesity and illness, or on the environmental end with pollution and climate change, that the detrimental effects of the food system come through in these kind of dispersed externalities, right? So they're on costs that aren't wrapped up in the actual costs that people are paying. And it seems to me like political systems at the end of the day are having a lot of trouble doing anything about these externalities. And so I guess I'm wondering what advice you have to policy advocates to get policymakers to take the externalities of the food system seriously.
Yeah, there is a lot of work on that, and so nobody has really come up with a definitive answer to that. But where I think the most promising course is to get companies to think in the long term. The food system de facto right now, that system that I described that creates the reality for us, de facto it's business and it's agribusiness. But they're making their decisions on very short-term courses. And if you make an argument like this, actually I can go again to this techie example. Before 2007, not too long ago, if I asked you to name for me the leading cell phone companies, that everyone thought would be around forever, it was Research in Motion, it was Palm, it was Motorola. These days, those companies either have disappeared or they're struggling just to be alive. Research in Motion is thinking about going private just to survive. And the reason is that they didn't respond to the issues and opportunities that slapped them in the face, that said there's a totally different market, a totally different demand out there. So an argument that can be made to food companies that want to be around in 50 years rather than just the next quarter, the next year, is you need to take into account the resources, their availability over the span of time that you plan to be in business, and you need to take into account the well-being of your public. There is no future in a system that sells poison to its public. Sooner or later, mind you, and this is either bold or foolish to say, what happened to the tobacco companies is going to happen to big food in terms of public health concerns and suing, litigating, and essentially shutting down knowing poisoning of the public. So essentially, that's the course where I see that some companies are responding. Some companies that you would never have thought are actually responding. Now, you have to wait and see how serious they are about it. But some of the bigger names in the world are actually responding to that sort of logic.
Thank you. One more round of applause.
Okay, thank you. Nice to meet you.